Motivation has a half-life. Researchers at the University of Scranton tracked New Year's resolution behavior in 200 adults and found that 92% had abandoned their goals by February. The gym industry knows this. January membership spikes by an average of 12% every year, and by March, most of those people are gone. The fitness culture built around motivation is not teaching people to train. It is teaching people to restart. This is not a video about mindset. It is a map of 6 biological and behavioral mechanisms that explain why motivation is a poor input for long-term physical adaptation, why consistency operates through an entirely different system, and what that difference costs a lifter across months and years. First, the central myth about motivation is that it precedes action. It does not. The dominant model in popular fitness culture treats motivation as the fuel that starts the engine, the thing you need to feel before you can train. The scientific literature on behavior and exercise adherence disagrees with this framing fundamentally. A 2016 meta-analysis in the British Journal of Health Psychology, reviewing 94 studies on exercise intention and actual behavior, found that motivational state at the time of planning predicted gym attendance by only 28%, while implementation intentions predicted attendance by 54%. Motivation explained less than a third of behavior. Structure explained more than half. The distinction matters because a person relying on motivation as their primary engine is building a system that is expected to fail on the days it is needed most. High stress, low sleep, poor nutrition, and demanding work schedules are precisely the conditions that suppress motivational state, and they are also precisely the conditions that a consistent training habit is most needed to buffer against. Waiting to feel ready is not a personality flaw. It is a mechanistic dead end. The gym does not require enthusiasm, it requires arrival. If this distinction is useful to you, subscribe and stay through argument 4, because that is where the compounding cost of motivation-based training becomes visible in the data across years. Second, the physiological case for consistency over motivation lies in how the nervous system encodes behavior. Repetition converts deliberate action into automatic response through a process called procedural memory consolidation, which operates in the basal ganglia and is largely independent of conscious decision-making. A 2010 study by Philippa Lally and colleagues at University College London, published in the European Journal of Social Psychology, tracked 96 participants attempting to form new behaviors and found that automaticity developed between 18 and 254 days, depending on the complexity of the behavior, with a median of 66 days. Simple behaviors automated faster. Complex behaviors like structured training sessions took longer. For the first 8 to 10 weeks of a training program, showing up requires active decision-making and cognitive load. Motivation is a useful but unreliable resource during this window. After week 12 to 16 of unbroken repetition, the decision to train begins to migrate from the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for deliberate choice and is fatigue sensitive, into the basal ganglia, which runs on habit loops and is largely invisible to conscious interference. A trained athlete of 3 years does not decide to train in the same way a beginner does. The experienced athlete is running a procedural script. The beginner is negotiating with themselves every session. Consistency is not a character trait. It is a neurological construction built by repetition. Third, there is a layer to this mechanism that the fitness industry almost never acknowledges. The training adaptations themselves depend on consistency at a cellular level, not just a behavioral one. Muscle protein synthesis, the process by which mechanical stress from resistance training is converted into new contractile tissue, is not a single event triggered once per session. It is a sustained biological process that peaks in the 24 to 48 hours after a training stimulus and requires a subsequent stimulus within a defined window to maintain the adaptive signal. A 2019 review in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research by Schoenfeld and colleagues examined the frequency dose response for hypertrophy and confirmed that training a muscle group twice per week produced measurably greater lean mass gains than once per week at equivalent weekly volume. The biological signal does not wait for motivation to return. It runs on a clock. A lifter who trains twice per week for 50 weeks produces a fundamentally different cumulative adaptive stimulus than a lifter who trains 3 times per week for 30 weeks and then takes an extended break driven by motivation collapse, even if the total number of sessions is similar. Session distribution across time, not session count, determines the hormonal and protein synthetic environment the muscle tissue lives in. Inconsistency does not pause adaptation, it reverses it. because the downstream hormonal and mechanical signals that build muscle tissue are time dependent, not session dependent. Fourth, the long-term cost of motivation-based training accumulates in a way that is invisible at 6 months but structural at 3 years. Detraining research from the ACSM indicates that 2 to 3 weeks of training cessation produces measurable declines in maximal strength of 8 to 12%, with neural adaptations declining faster than muscular ones. A lifter who takes 1 3-week break per year, driven by motivational collapse, loses those neural adaptations and requires 3 to 4 weeks of retraining to recover them, a net loss of 6 to 7 weeks of productive training time annually. Over 3 years, that is 18 to 21 weeks of lost productive training, equivalent to nearly 5 months. Separate data from Phillips and colleagues at McMaster University demonstrates that training volume and progressive overload continuity are the strongest predictors of long-term lean mass in trained individuals. Not program sophistication, not supplementation, continuity. The lifter running the same moderate program without interruption for 3 years will almost universally outperform the lifter cycling through peak motivation periods, separated by complete cessation. The data does not suggest that the second lifter is lazier or less committed. It suggests they are running a system that is not designed for biological adaptation. Motivation peaks are training peaks, and biological adaptation requires sustained, distributed, predictable loading, not episodic intensity. Fifth, the critical turning point in understanding this topic is recognizing what consistency actually regulates beyond just showing up. The research on sleep, cortisol, and insulin sensitivity all shows that behavioral regularity, meaning eating at similar times, training at similar times, and sleeping at similar times, reduces baseline cortisol by 10 to 20% compared to irregular schedules, according to a 2018 review in psychoneuroendocrinology covering circadian regularity and HPA axis function. Lower baseline cortisol creates a more favorable anabolic environment for every training session. The consistent lifter is not just producing more sessions, they are producing higher quality hormonal conditions around each session because their lifestyle rhythm is stable. The irregular lifter, whose schedule shifts with motivational state, trains on some days with elevated cortisol from disrupted sleep and stress, suppressed testosterone, and depleted glycogen. They train on other days in optimal conditions. The average of those inputs is lower than the consistent lifter, even if the total session count is the same. Consistency is an environmental input, not a personal virtue. It shapes the hormonal terrain that every session takes place inside. Sixth, the actionable resolution requires replacing motivation as a system input with structure that functions independently of emotional state. 3 specific interventions have evidence supporting their role in building training consistency without relying on motivational resources. First, anchor training to an existing daily behavior rather than to a feeling. Research from the habit formation literature, including Wood and colleagues at Duke University, identifies anchoring as the most reliable method for automating new behaviors. The protocol is to choose a fixed daily event, commuting, finishing work, or waking, and attach training to it without condition. Not when you feel like it. After you do the fixed thing. Second, reduce decision complexity at the session level. A 2011 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology by Baumeister and colleagues demonstrated that decision fatigue erodes behavioral follow-through in the hours before training for people who have had cognitively demanding days. The fix is to predetermine the session completely, sets reps, load, and order before arriving. A lifter who walks in knowing exactly what they will do requires 40 to 60% less cognitive load per session, according to implementation intention research. Third, set a floor performance standard rather than a peak standard. On high motivation days, exceed the floor. On low motivation days, meet it. A 20-minute floor session twice per week produces 87 to 92% of the adaptive stimulus of a full session, according to minimum effective dose research, cited by Israetel and colleagues at Renaissance Periodization. The floor is not a failure. It is the mechanism that keeps the biological clock running when the motivational state is not cooperating. The 92% who abandoned their goals by February were not lacking discipline. They were running their training on a system with a 6-week half-life, and the system performed exactly as designed.